All right, thanks. Well, my name is Mitch Darden, and by experience, I am not a Sea Scouter. I'm just going to I get that question asked a lot, but just as a general background, I was a land scout. My kids were land scouts, and um, scouting has been a really big part of my life. It was a de facto portion of my pseudo father because I didn't have a dad growing up. So scouting meant a lot to me. And my other interests have included the ocean and being around the ocean and the beaches and beachcombing and, sailing and boating and all that. I'm not actually a boater, but I enjoy everything that has to do with the sea. I always have. And as a kid growing up, I wanted to be an archaeologist. That was a huge passion of mine growing up. And when my patch collecting uh, um, became more complicated and more focused, it eventually evolved into um, being an amateur Sea Scout historian. So I'm going to be the first one to say that I am not at the top of my game. There are several actual Sea Scouters that have way, way more knowledge about the history of Sea Scouting than I do. And there's a few of them that are assembling histories. Um, some of them are local histories, some of them are national histories. Um, I'm just following this as a passion project. I formed the Sea Scout Archive about 4 years ago, right as COVID was about to hit. And the reason, the last shoe to drop was when the Portland, Oregon sea base was folding up. And I was asked to come down there and salvage whatever could be salvaged. It turned out that there were a lot of historical relics down there, artifacts, ephemera, paperwork. There was a lot of history. And because I had some relationships down there, I was invited to salvage it for the Sea Scout for Sea Scout history, and that was the kernel around which I created the Sea Scout Archive, because the collection at that point had reached a tipping point, and it was more of a historically significant collection um, than it was just basically trying to get a run of baseball cards. It became much more of a historical endeavor at that point, for sure. There was just no denying it at that point. They had the 1936 national flagship flag down there, from the Columbia, and many other things. Portland, Oregon was a big area in Sea Scouts and still remains relatively. So that's a little bit about me, my background, how I got into Sea Scout history. What we're going to see tonight is more of a presentation on Sea Scout history, or a small fraction of it, and less of a patch collection. Although there will be some patches intertwined throughout the presentation. First off, I want to say that the presentation that I've been able to show you guys today, I did not create this presentation. I had a small role in collecting some of the information, and the principal person who did all the heavy lifting, 99% of it, is a gentleman by the name of Tom Fawthrop, a relatively well-known Sea Scout in our area. He came up as a Sea Scout in the area, and eventually rose through different ships, the ship officerships and positions, and was eventually Commodore in the Seattle area, and also had a daughter, and they started a ship. So he has a vast amount of experience in sea scouting, especially what we call the Pacific Northwest, which is a little bit beyond the Puget Sound area. It includes Oregon and lower Alaska. So without further ado, I selected this presentation of Tom's because I thought it was a really nice sort of snapshot of the golden age of Sea Scouting in our area in the Pacific Northwest. The Sea Scout Ship Adventurer began right as Sea Scouting was really heating up in our area, and ended some years after a vast drop-off in Sea Scout participation. You're going to see a lot of information. This presentation, this is kind of a 2.0. The first version of the presentation, I will navigate onto the Sea Scout archive and show you guys where you can look at it a little bit slower, because I'm going to whip through it. I know that my time is limited, and I don't want to basically read off a bunch of information on slides. And there's a lot of information here, and there's a lot of slides. So the intention is just to give a brief overview, and that you guys can go back and look at most of these slides later on the Sea Scout archive if you wish. So the Sea Scout adventure began in 1934 and had several sponsors. You can see them listed there, or have for a while. There was some renumbering, not uncommon. There was different ships involved. What you will find really common, especially anywhere near any military bases, especially naval installations, is it was relatively common for Sea Scouts to get surplus vessels from the Navy, from the Coast Guard, depending on the various connections of the people involved in the Sea Scouts and their proximity to the installations. In the beginning, in the teens, 20s, and even through the 30s, most often the vessels that seemed to come easier or easiest to the Sea Scouts were called whalers or service boats. Basically, they're open, wooden, just very basic sort of small craft. Throughout the ages, you're going to see what they do with them. They take them and they build cabins on them sometimes, or they level up and get ones with nice engines and things of that nature. But anyway, this is a basic overview here. It talks about the sponsorship, a couple of the boats that they had, and I'm going to move past this because, again, I'm going to show you where you can come back and read this if you want. There were, we believe there were quartermasters before 57, but it gets kind of tough when you get back before the 50s on some of this paperwork. You will notice the first one, Frank Rosine. That name is going to become familiar to you as we move throughout these slides, because he was the most notable later patriarchal skipper of the adventure. Now, the adventurer, and the names down here, Martin Bennell, we're going to talk about him again briefly, Tim Wilkerson. So quartermasters is a big deal in Sea Scouts. Most, if not all of you, are really probably very familiar already with quartermaster. What all of you may or may not be familiar with is that beyond a congruent amount of sea skills they have to learn in comparison to the Eagle Award, they also have to jump through a few more hoops. Not only do they have to do a service project and learn a long list of sea skills, very similar, like I say, congruent to Eagle requirements, they also have to go through several committees to get approval, and they have to deal with a long cruise, and they have some additional requirements. There's a lot less quartermasters in the world than there are Eagle Scouts, and if you look up the requirements for those separately, it's pretty cool. So through the 40s, here they have this gaff rig, really more primitive schooner. The original ship sponsor, Kirkland Service Club. Briefly, Kirkland is probably familiar to most people if you have Costco membership. Costco originated in Kirkland. Kirkland is on Lake Washington, and it resides now in the greater Seattle Metroplex. When Frank Rosine was growing up in the 30s, it was still pretty much a Norman Rockwell type of town, and I get this through interviewing him. He would tell me stories about how he grew up, and what is really cool, and it's almost a perfect storm, is his family had waterfront property on Lake Washington. So, he became a Sea Scout. He became a quartermaster. This was the only Sea Scout unit in Kirkland. And he had waterfront property, which to a Sea Scout unit is just absolutely a perfect storm. We have documented newspaper articles of the boys or Frank or both of them actually seeing people on Lake Washington in distress and performing rescues, which was not uncommon for Sea Scouts through the 30s, 40s, 50s, but it's just even more so in the 60s and 70s, just because of where Frank lived. Lake Washington is a busy lake. It's got a lot of people on it, and pretty much the heart of Seattle. And it was just a neat part of what they were doing in Sea Scouts. They used to meet at his house. Frank was single. His first love passed away, unfortunately, before they got married. He wound up adopting a boy with special needs at one point, but he was able to focus a lot of his time and energy on the Sea Scouts. And we were able to interview him before he passed away in December of last year. And I'll show you where those interviews are as well. I'm not sure we need to spend a whole lot of time on every slide again, but they won some regattas, not uncommon. The picture actually is not the Adventurer. It's a council boat called the Tyee Scout. During the Depression, it was de facto a part of the Mosquito Fleet, getting kids to Camp Parsons. And also, the Tyee Scout and the Highview Scout both would deliver mail, both scout and non-scout, and take people around. It was a really, really huge PR piece to Seattle Council, and I think it was instrumental in drumming up the numbers. I'm just going to move past this real quick. In the 50s, they changed boats to a tunnel stern tug, which former Army vessel. Is a big deal. These wooden boats, they don't last forever, and it's usually really, really expensive to maintain them. Oftentimes, Sea Scouts would run out of resources to maintain some of these boats, just due to age. And we got to keep in mind they were used when they got them as well. This is just a continuance of the dedication ceremony and launch of it, another continuation. And in the late 50s, 57, they changed to a torpedo seaplane tender. This was not a sailing craft, obviously. Two 671 GM diesels. There's sailing ships and there's motorized vehicles. This was obviously a motorized vehicle and a big step up. I know they won regional at one point. We still have the plaque from this 1958 International Powerboat Race. Sea Scouts often would be involved in civilian non-Sea Scout events as well, races and cruises and regattas and things of that nature. It so happens that Frank was very involved in his local Catholic church and remained that way even after Sea Scouts for decades and decades. And as a direct result of that, sponsorship at one point was through the church, and there was a lot of guys that earned their religious medals. There's Frank in the right-hand picture, just behind the I want to say Archbishop, yeah, Connolly. So just to the left in the right-hand picture, that's Frank Rosine right there behind Archbishop Connolly. 7074 gas sloop Ark, just another ship in the 70s. I know for a fact that many, or I should say several of the Sea Scout vessels were moored at his property on Lake Washington for off and on, intermittently as needed, and sometimes they would just take it over as the need arose for the adventure unit. 70s highlights: Northwestern Regatta, Santa Maria crew. Tom Fawthrop was an old Santa Maria guy. Chatting with Jeff Tikeen and Robert Bennell, Northwestern Regatta. By the 70s, the Northwestern Regatta had dramatically shrunk in size. And that was an artifact of the Sea Scout membership as a whole declining. It was in the 70s, that was kind of a perfect storm between rising insurance costs for the activities that they were doing and them having to pay for them themselves. In addition to that, it's really hard for a national organization to rationalize the expenditure of the Sea Scout vessels with a shrinking membership overall, and most notably, by comparison, a dramatically smaller number of scouts in Sea Scouts. So it's really hard to rationalize that. This is some of the quartermasters and bosuns. An area bosun is the equivalent of basically a senior patrol leader for a whole area of Sea Scouts. I think we have some equivalents in ventures for sure, but it's not at the national level. It's more at the area level. And they have a big role in some of the area events like rendezvous and regattas. But I've also seen them having their own, basically, committees and cabinets, like within the greater Portland area and especially the Seattle area. Tom Fawthrop could speak a lot more to that, but basically like another tier of leadership, not necessarily underneath, but almost alongside some of the skippers and adult leaders. So there's bosuns. That's what boatswain, that's how you pronounce that area, bosun. Keyport, Naval Torpedo Station, Mertwell Rendezvous. Eventually, the Regional 11 events kind of tailored off, and in about 1972, it was reduced to the Mertwell Rendezvous at Keyport. Mertwells was a older, well-known Sea Scout local guy that he passed away either late 70s, early 80s, I forget which, but it was named after him. That's a whole nother topic of discussion. More 70s highlights. You see Adventure Boat and Crew in the October Fall Rendezvous, group shots, the Bennells and so forth, mostly snapshots, different boats that they had. Robert Bennell, later quartermaster and Cowley tug captain, received a certificate of merit from Captain Barnard Bruce, former Council Commodore, for his actions when he rescued a father and son upon capsizing their sailboat in Lake Washington. That was just one of the rescues that the Adventure and other local Sea Scouts were involved with. Later on, when Frank was in dramatically declining health, the person that took care of him was Robert. I mean, he was the guy who really saw it through to the end. And that right there is a snapshot of my takeaway from interviewing these Sea Scouts. They formed bonds that I would, from my own perspective, I know it's only anecdotal evidence, but from my perspective, they formed bonds that to me seem much stronger in many ways than land scouts. I don't know if it has to do with the intimacy on long cruises and having to rely on each other to keep yourself safe, or the exclusivity of the Sea Scout program. It has always seemed to me a lot more of a family and a lot more intimate for some reason. Not necessarily xenophobic, but definitely a different flavor in the Boy Scout program than I was accustomed to. I didn't even know there were Sea Scouts until I was an adult. This was an opportunity afforded one of the scouts, John Nadler. He went on a tall sailor ship, 7-day adventure sailing experience aboard the Sagres. He was chosen to represent the Nor'wester area in Chief Sail Council, Class 8 tall ship. Anyway, there's some interesting information on it. It was just a neat opportunity. This is just one example of a long cruise that they took. For those who don't know that much about long cruises, and I don't want to insult anybody, but just briefly, the Sea Scouts, instead of going to summer camp, their equivalent is what's called a long cruise. And in the summer, they take off for a week, usually. And oftentimes, the Sea Scouts in the Pacific Northwest, starting in the early 20s, actually, if their boats could do it and they had the wherewithal and the skills and they had big enough vessels, they would take them all the way up to Alaska, which is pretty cool. I mean, that's a pretty cool opportunity to go up to the San Juans or Alaska, which is what we see nowadays, or we would view as a high adventure. But this is a typical long cruise up to San Juan Islands and the Gulf Islands from Seattle, through the Salish Sea. And this is just a little blurb on Frank, and it's just kind of a thumbnail where it says a recipient of the Maritime District Award of Merit from probably the 30s through the 70s approximately. The Sea Scouts were so robust in the Pacific Northwest area that they were actually called the Maritime District. It's kind of neat. This was a shot taken at the service. In fact, I probably took this shot. On the very far left is Tom Fawthrop. He's the gentleman who actually made this presentation. He gets full credit for it. And I just want to make sure that that's put out there. I did not do almost any of this work at all. I was instrumental in pulling some of the resources to him, but that is my big claim to fame on this presentation. It's kind of amazing to me that in 2023, 19 Sea Scouts attended Frank's memorial service. That's a pretty big turnout. I don't know what else to say other than that is a big indicator of the intimacy and family, the Sea Scout family. And it was almost like a reunion for some of these guys who hadn't seen each other for a while. Speaking of reunions, it was not uncommon for Sea Scout ships to have reunions, even after the ship folded. So here's where we can talk a little bit about patches. The patch on the left there is the ship medallion for the adventure. And if it looks familiar to you, it should for good reason. We'll explain later. But that is the ship medallion. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ship medallions, on the right shoulder, oftentimes in dress blues, especially dress whites, the unit called a ship would display a medallion, which would be more elaborative of kind of their mascot, I guess, is the closest thing I could equate it to. It could be associated with the name of their vessel, or it could be just associated with the name of the ship to distinguish. In Sea Scouts, the ship is the equivalent of the land troop, for those of you who don't know, and the vessel, Sea Scouts always calls their boats vessels. They never call it the ship, because the ship means something else in Sea Scouting world. Let me see, that's just one of their charters, and lots more ephemera and pictures. we were very fortunate to be able to have access to Frank Rosine's archives and his materials, and he was very, very gracious and generous with his time. On the upper left is a shot of his house on the waterfront. So if you go to the left and up, there's a black and white picture. That was Frank's home. That's where he grew up, right next to one of the ferries. And the kids would sometimes just hang out on the deck. Sometimes they'd hang out at Frank's house, even though there wasn't a meeting. It was kind of a refuge. And I think that speaks volumes to the reason why there were at least 19 Sea Scouts at his memorial service, like 80 years later, or 60 years later anyway. Just a plethora of vessel shots. A lot of times these ships required a lot of work, and if you weren't out on the water, then you were probably working on the ship, maintaining it, improving it. A lot of work goes into these things. I wanted to complement the slideshow, since there's not a lot of patches, with some ephemera and patch-like stuff for those of you guys that were kind of looking for something like that, and talk a little bit more about some of the numbers that we briefly touched on as far as the golden age of the 30s through the 60s. We have here an article. I was able to cull about 100 articles out of Cedar Chips, a local Chief Seattle Council magazine, and just kind of picking through those, I pulled out some stuff that talks a little bit about the beginning of the golden age. The Cedar Chips died out, I believe, after the 40s, so what we have is the beginning of that kind of cresting. It says at the beginning of 1939, 198 scouts were registered in Sea Scout ships, and there are now more than 325. So in the early to mid 30s is when Sea Scouting, well, late 20s technically, is when it first started becoming real noticeable out here in the Pacific Northwest. But in the early 30s, it started picking up, and by the mid to late 30s, it was starting to boom. And part of that is because we have so much waterfront, and part of it was, and I'll show you in a minute, that was 1939. Let me see here. I'll tell you. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We got 10 boats from the council, with 500 scouts on a regional cruise here. This is in, let me see, March 35. 500 Sea Scouts. That's a lot of Sea Scouts. Nowadays, we have, I think it's 4 or 5 boats in Seattle proper, and for the whole council, it's like maybe 7. And I don't have the numbers off the tip of my head, but it's probably around 5 to 10 Sea Scouts per boat. So dramatically shrunk, of course. Okay, this is what I wanted to get to. So this article is from October 39, right before that first article that we talked about. But if you see here, everything is going up. The entire scouting program is going up. The angle of increase doesn't even really compare to total Boy Scout membership or Land Scouts or even Cubs. Cubs is where it's really starting to go crazy. But if you look at the angle of inclination there, from 1932 to 1938, it's essentially a flat line for Sea Scouts. Cubs is starting to go up, Scouts a little bit, but for Sea Scouts, it's a flat line. In 38, that's when things started to go just nuts. This is just some more numbers. This is the 1932 baseline that we were talking about. They were crowing about 5,000 in the area. We have to keep in mind the Chief Seattle Council at that time also included Alaska, so that's why it's on there. Sea Scouts, we've got from January 1932, we got 144 to December, we have 154. Not much change. Some small growth, but not much change. So the golden age really happened in the late 30s. That's when it really started taking off for us. Numbers peaked out probably in the 50s, and by the 60s they were starting to drop off. Part of it was, like I say, the counterculture and the Cultural Revolution of the 70s, but also, um, the Vietnam period and all that. But so we had socio-political changes, but we also had economic factors with the advent of more expensive insurance. That may have something to do with why they made Sea Explorers co-ed in 1972. I'm sure there's some sort of connection there. I didn't bring any numbers after the 30s because I had to put a limit somewhere on this. But this is kind of interesting. In 38, this is one of these huge amphitheaters with all these scouts that were meeting for a scout circus. And I just thought it was kind of funny that the John Paul Jones here, which was one of the Sea Scout ships, was notable. They were doing what does it say here? They were doing a pioneering act. But anyway, so when I look at this, yeah, there was an increase in Sea Scouts, definitely, but there was also an increase in all scouting. So I think it was partially an artifact of that. Let me see here. Oh, this is notable. This was the last paragraph. At the bottom of this, let me see, it's an article from April 1932. They talk about 25 ships. Sea Scout vessels from the entire region will be on hand. Expected that the fleet will number about 25 ships for this event. Much more than we have now. Many, many more than we have now. Okay, so here is some of the materials that Frank Rosine donated to the Sea Scout Archive. I'm going to zoom in on a little bit. Again, this is online. I'll show you where it is later. This is that cruiser race plaque that we were talking about in, I think it was 56. They actually worked at the World's Fair. They worked at the 1962 World's Fair. They worked at Expo 74 in Spokane. They were a member of the Power Squadron. Power Squadron was a great way to get nautical training. We have some early ranks, 25-year patch. I thought this was pretty cool. This was kind of a neat little story that he told me. I asked about this Kirkland chain stitch, and Frank said, well, we were at the World Expo, we were at the World's Fair, and we needed it, and so we just went upstairs somewhere in the building. They had somebody with a small business, and they knocked them out. So that's chain stitch unit number and dress blues Kirkland CSP there. Pretty cool. Let me see, National Standard Explorer unit. It's all pretty self-explanatory to most of the audience, I'm sure. Let me see here. There's another piece of framed ephemera. Now, this is Frank's actual shadow box that he put together. These are his awards that were kind of listed out in that thumbnail. With Sea Badge, an early Sea Badge, of course. And Silver Beaver, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty nice little sea scouting career. This is just another frame of some of the bosuns that were on the adventure and quartermasters. It's for display purposes when we do physical displays for the Sea Scout Archive at local Sea Scout events. I think that's about it for the ephemera. This is a funny little story. So I promised you I'd tell you more about this or where it came from. For those of you who didn't know, this is the Region 11 sigil from their patches, and they had stacks of this stuff. So Frank just cut out the middle of it, the compass point. He thought it looked pretty cool, and that's what they used. The ones that they used were this old Region 11 twill. Eventually, it morphed into Northwestern Regatta region, Western region Regatta, et cetera. But I cribbed this from a buddy of mine, Dan St. Marie. Dan, if you ever see this, I'm sorry, man, I didn't ask permission, but I didn't have a picture handy, so I just swiped it. So that's the origin of their ship medallion. There was one other ship that did the exact same thing. It's the Sunsail that operated out of Portland, Oregon for many, many years. And that's all I have to say about that.